Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Friday if you're watching this live. I hope you and your families are doing well. I'm Katie Jacobs from the CIPD, and I've been hosting the CIPD's series of coronavirus webinars. And today we're going to be covering furlough. Yes, again, joining me this afternoon, we've got David D'Souza, Membership Director of the CIPD, Andrew Willis, Head of Legal and Advisory at HR Inform, the CIPD's Employment Law Resource, and Jennifer Hillier, HR Director at Domestic and General. Now, this is the third and, dare I say, possibly final webinar we'll be doing on furlough. Both the previous webinars we've done on this subject are available on demand from the CIPD website. If you haven't watched them, I would encourage you to do so, as they would hopefully answer a lot of your questions. First up, some quick housekeeping. Please be aware this session is being recorded. It will be available on demand via the webinar section of the CIPD website. Please do share it with your peers and colleagues. We've had a lot of questions submitted in advance, which is great. If you want to submit additional questions during the webinar, could I ask you please to use the Q&A tab, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. Please do not use the chat box for questions. This isn't going to be monitoring and it's a bit distracting to have it popping up the whole time. Also, all attendees are muted, so any questions need to be submitted via typing. We probably won't be able to answer all your questions in the time we've got. If you have any questions that aren't answered, CIPD members can call our HR Inform helpline. It's available 24/7 and you will get an individual response. And we're updating the FAQs on our website all the time as new information becomes available. Head to the CIPD Coronavirus Hub for more. We're doing 2 webinars a week at the moment. Next week, we're going to be running 2, one on looking after your remote workers and one on looking after key workers. You can register for these now via the CIPD website. So today we're talking about the government's coronavirus job retention scheme, which allows employers to claim government grants for furloughed employees. Now we know while the scheme is welcome, there has been quite a bit of confusion among the HR community, and we know that you're working night and day to protect and support your organisations and your people. We hope the previous 2 webinars and today will be useful in providing some clarity. As always, where we don't have the information or the government guidance yet, we'll make it clear. And our focus today is mainly going to be on what comes after the furlough period. Our running order. First up, David's going to give a quick overview and set some context. Then Andrew is going to give a quick legal update, as quite a lot of guidance has been released in the last week or so. And then Jenny is going to talk us through how D&G approached furlough and what the plans are for the next steps. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. So David, could I please hand over to you to give a quick welcome? Thanks.
Hello, welcome everyone. As Katie says, this is the 3rd part of what we hope is an exciting trilogy on furlough. It may be that, similar to other film franchises, that we have to come back and do some more as people write some more things. Last week I urged everyone to be compassionate in the way that they dealt with this, both in thinking actually about how difficult it is for people to craft policy, frustrating as it is for us to have to try and execute in the absence of guidance, but also in terms of your fellow professionals who are all trying to make sense of this at the same time. I also said that anyone commenting on this last week only had 2 weeks worth of experience, so you had to take anything that was said with a pinch of salt. Luckily, anyone commenting on it now had 50% more experience than last week, so we're considerably more experienced and able to kind of talk to this with confidence. In terms of how much times have changed, I bought this book from Amazon less than a month ago, and it was called What We Really Do All Day, and it was analysis of how people spend their time at work and at home. And I've never imagined a book could go out of date before I'd have the opportunity to read it in the way that that has. Everything has changed, everything has shifted. The parameters of your job have changed, the parameters of people's expectations have changed. So I'm really glad that we're giving you a combination of practical real-world experience and legal expertise and advice today. Do make use of it, do ask questions, make use of our helplines and communities as well. But otherwise, also look after yourself, really important at these times. So I will hand over to Andrew.
Yeah, many thanks, David. Hello, everybody. When we started talking about this session earlier this week, we envisage talking about the guidance issued last Thursday, I should say, late Thursday, the 9th. Just updating the guidance with 1 or 2 clarifications. And that's where we started from when we started planning this session. But then on Wednesday, a couple of very significant announcements were made. Firstly, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the eligibility date for the furlough scheme changed from the 28th of Feb to the 19th of May. We'll talk about that in a moment, because then later on Wednesday, the Treasury issued a Treasury direction which sets out the way the furlough scheme will operate. And really, this is the legislation we've been waiting for. Although normally you would see legislation in an Act of Parliament or statutory instrument, this really carries the same weight as a statutory instrument in that it's made and issued under authority granted by the Coronavirus Act. So really, your first port of call now, if you have a question about the scheme and how it is intended to operate, you would look first to the Treasury direction, and the guidance is what it says it is. It's guidance supporting that, but obviously the primary source is now the direction. Now, in large part, what's been issued in this direction coincides with what we understood the position to be and what we'd seen before. But in a couple of respects, there have actually been some quite significant changes, and the first one concerns agreement to furlough. So what the direction now makes clear is that to claim furlough, an employer and an employee must have agreed in writing that the employee will cease all work. And this is on the next slide, I believe. I've set this out on the next slide with the other important elements from the direction. So we're looking at the first bullet here. So to claim furlough, the employer and employee must have agreed in writing that the employee will cease all work in relation to their employment. Now, the guidance before only seemed to require notification to employees, whereas now agreement is required, clearly required under the wording of the direction. So this has caused some consternation, as you can imagine, because many employers, I believe, have been happy to assume agreement in the absence of a response to a written notification, and I've done no more than that. Now, I don't think it's necessary to revisit the whole thing in huge detail or be concerned that people furloughed to date will not be covered under the scheme, but I think it probably would be wise, if you're doing a follow-up letter to employees who are furloughed, just to mention that you are required to secure the employer's agreement that they have ceased and will cease all work. There's nothing in the direction that says agreement had to be upfront. So we're assuming retrospective agreement is allowed, and a follow-up letter like that, which requires a simple email response of a line or two confirming agreement, should be enough. But it is important to note that the what an agreement looks like for these purposes has changed as a result of this direction being issued. Earlier in the week, there was a High Court case concerning the Carluccio's restaurant business, which is in administration currently, sadly. And it was brought by the company's administrators, and they were seeking guidance on what amounted to agreement to furlough for their own reasons. And in that case, the judge suggested, or the judgment suggested, that a letter simply stating that if the employee didn't respond by a certain date, that they would be assumed to have agreed to being furloughed. You have to say now that this direction that was issued a couple of days later probably means you need a little bit more than that. You probably do need written agreement. But as I say, it's made explicit in the direction that email communication is sufficient. And as I say, a one-liner just to confirm agreement should be fine. The other couple of points that are worth mentioning around the direction are firstly around what can and can't be claimed under the scheme. So it's made clear that the scheme must disregard anything which isn't regular wages or salary. And what shouldn't be included is any performance-related bonus, any discretionary payments, including tips, any conditional payments not really defined further, and any non-financial benefits. So basically, anything you recover under the scheme should be paid to your employees in money form, subject to the usual deductions. We talked last time about compulsory commission being allowed. Nothing in this direction seems to disturb that, and for compulsory commission, we read contractual commission on the basis it was contrasted with discretionary commission in the original guidance. So I think compulsory or contractual commission payments are still fine, but you must exclude those other elements from the pay that you are seeking reimbursement for. And we also talked last time about directors, whether directors could be furloughed, and we clarified that they could be furloughed according to the guidance in place at that time, as long as they didn't do any more than carry out their duties. There's a bit more clarification as to what amounts to duties in this direction, and they are quite limited. They are limited to duties or obligations arising by or under statute relating either to the filing of company accounts or to the provision of other information that's required under statute. So directors can't do any more than that, and certainly they cannot work nor can any employee on furlough carry out any work at all for their organisation. So that's clarification as to what amounts to directors' duties for these purposes, and that summarises the main elements of the direction that maybe depart a little bit from what we understood to be the case before. So if we move on to the next slide, this concerns the eligibility date, which is moved now from 28th February to 19th of March. And this was announced a little bit earlier on Wednesday. So Wednesday was a busy day for updates in terms of this. That new guidance confirmed that the eligibility date for the JRS has been extended now to the 19th of March, and that was the day before the scheme was announced. Employers can claim for furloughed employees that were employed and on their PAYE payroll on or before that date. However, there's clarification about what is meant by on the payroll, because a new requirement's been introduced here. On the payroll effectively means that the employee must have been notified to HMRC through an RTI or real-time information submission, notifying payment in respect of that employee on or before the 19th of March. So before, there was vague reference to employees being on the payroll on the relevant date, which was 28th of Feb, which is now the 19th of March. Now it's been clarified that that means there must have been a submission in respect to that person to HMRC, real-time submission on or before the 19th of March. And you can see that some new starters that might otherwise qualify under the scheme, especially if they're being paid monthly, might now miss out as a result of that requirement. And that requirement's clearly been introduced as an anti-fraud measure. So the concern is that declarations might be made that people were on the payroll when they weren't. The cast iron way of the government being sure, and HMRC being sure that they were on the payroll, is to be able to look to a notification on or prior to that date. So that's the additional requirement now in terms of the eligibility date. We talked last time about rehires, and it's been clarified that the new date applies to rehires in the following sense. So employees who are employed and on payroll as of the 28th of February, and again, that means that they must have been the subject of an RTI submission on or before that date. And importantly, who were made redundant or stopped working for the employer after that date, after the 28th of Feb, but before the 19th of March, can also qualify for the scheme if the employer re-employs them and puts them on furlough. Now, we talked last time about the difficulties and risks inherent in rehiring people. Appreciate that many organisations will want to do that where they can, to do the best for their former employees. But it does carry risks, and also there's that additional requirement now there's only a little window there into which qualifying employees can fall. They must have been on the payroll and employed on the 28th of Feb, and they then must have been made redundant or stopped working for the employer after that date, but before the 19th of March. So that's the clarification around the eligibility date. And obviously, as a result of that, a number of employees will now qualify who didn't before. So it's certainly a positive move, but introduces a little bit of complication as well. The next slide, please. So now we have dealt with the two matters that were discussed and published on Wednesday. And we're just looking now quickly at the updated guidance that was published last Friday, the 9th of April, which no longer stipulates, for example, that shielding employees can only be furloughed where they would otherwise have been made redundant. There's no requirement now for furloughing to be an alternative to redundancy, definitely not in the case of shielding employees. The guidance now states that employees who are shielding can be furloughed if they are unable to work because they're shielding in line with public health guidance. It also states it is up to employers to decide whether to furlough these employees. You would still need to consider whether or not the employees can work from home, but if they can't, you're free to furlough them. Next slide, please. And again, similar messages in terms of people absent through sickness or self-isolation. So the guidance is still clear that if an employee is receiving SSP, they cannot be furloughed, and that's to avoid double recovery from public funds. But employees on sick leave or self-isolating can be furloughed as long as they no longer receive SSP. Now, again, the Treasury direction is worth noting here because there's a little bit more information around how exactly this will be applied. The direction states that where an employer gives an instruction to an employee to cease work at a time when SSP is payable, in other words, when they are on qualifying sick leave or self-isolation, then the period of furlough cannot commence until the actual or deemed period of SSP has ended. So in terms of that first sickness episode, if it occurs at the time the person would have been furloughed, then they cannot commence furlough. However, it then goes on to state that any further period of sickness that would normally lead to an SSP entitlement doesn't break the period of furlough. So the suggestion is that the first period of sickness is paid at SSP, but any subsequent periods you are free to go ahead and furlough the employee. Bear in mind as well that when thinking about sickness, furlough needs to be for a minimum of 3 weeks. So any period of sickness under the arrangements I've just discussed might be affected by sickness. So be careful around that and make sure that you are furloughing for a minimum of 3 weeks to ensure you can reclaim wage costs under the scheme. Next slide, please. And this is on caring responsibilities. Again, the guidance issued last week talked about those who are absent from work because they had caring responsibilities resulting from the coronavirus outbreak. And the example was given of those having to look after children. They can now be furloughed. Again, no requirement that they would otherwise be made redundant. The words employer must be severely affected by coronavirus still do appear in the guidance. However, the Treasury direction makes it clear that the scheme isn't limited to those whose employers would otherwise have been made redundant. And it states it applies to those who are furloughed by reason of circumstances as a result of coronavirus or coronavirus disease. So a pretty low bar now, it seems, to qualify for this scheme. It is worth bearing in mind its overarching purpose, though. It's clearly not for employers who felt no impact at all from coronavirus, although I imagine they are pretty few and far between. Next slide, please. Thanks. Quick one on 2P. So there was lots of confusion around 2P and how and whether it applied in these circumstances, and the guidance issues last week clarifies that a new employer, and I should say the Treasury direction as well, clarifies that a new employer, i.e. a transferee, is eligible to claim for their employees that have transferred in under the scheme if they transferred after the 19th of March, and if either 2P or pay business succession rules apply to the change in ownership. Of course, if the transfer occurred prior to the 19th of March now, they would qualify anyway as being on the payroll on the 19th of March, provided, of course, that real-time information submission's been made, which is what we talked about earlier. It's been clarified that anybody who transfers in after the 19th of March can be treated as qualifying for the scheme. The other thing to clarify on work during furlough out of the guidance concerns what employees can and cannot do. And it's been clarified what we already knew still stands, i.e. that you can't provide services to or generate for revenue for your organisation, but also you can't do so for any linked or associated organisation either. So you can't work across a group. If you're furloughed within one business, then you're furloughed for all. Quick note on foreign nationals, clarification that foreign nationals are eligible to be furloughed, and employers can furlough employers on all categories of visa. And also, next slide, on reclaimable national insurance and pension payments. The reclaimable national insurance contributions and the minimal pension contributions that can be reclaimed only apply in relation to the furlough element. So you can't pay somebody in full and reclaim the full NI contributions and pension payments, only that part or those parts that relate to the furlough pay. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's been clarified as well that no part of the grant paid to employers under the scheme can be used to fund benefits, nor can deductions be made for any fees or admin charges the employer might want to render. The entire sum recovered via the scheme must be paid to the employee, subject to the usual deductions, as we've said, for tax, national insurance and pension. That is the update arising from the guidance of last week, and importantly, the announcement and the direction issued on Wednesday. The last slide I prepared just looks at the options at the end of a furlough period. And really, when I was putting these slides together, I thought there were probably 4. You'd like to think that in some circumstances, it would be possible for employees to return to work and obviously return to normal pay and benefits at the same time. That's option 1. Option 2 would be a further period of furlough, assuming that you've agreed a limited period to begin with, which I know some employers have. Obviously, that continuing period of furlough will be subject to further agreement if necessary, and also, of course, continuation of the scheme, because as things stand, it's only funded until the end of May. This third bullet is an interesting one because, as I say, these slides were put together before we'd had time to digest what came out on Wednesday. And, you know, at that point, it seemed that you might be able to move a sick employee between furlough and sick leave and back again. However, based on the Treasury direction provision on this point, it seems now that, as we discussed earlier in the presentation, the first period of sickness is sickness for SSP purposes, but any subsequent periods during a furlough period, you would furlough rather than treat as sick and pay sick pay. And then, of course, the fourth option, which is on the horizon for some businesses, is the commencement or the continuation of redundancy consultation. And we'll probably address this a little bit when we discuss the questions, but obviously there's a risk of piggybacking a redundancy process onto a previous furlough selection exercise. Not least because furlough decisions were probably made in a hurry in many cases. people with medical issues or caring responsibilities may well have been prioritised for furlough, but obviously selecting on that basis leaves you wide open to discrimination claims. So I think if you are thinking of redundancies, I think the best course is to restart the selection process from scratch, think about the needs of the business and select in the usual way on that basis. Just a quick word on notice pay as well. It's not 100% clear right now whether notice pay can be reimbursed under the furlough scheme. Of course, here we're talking about options at the end of furlough, but some questions have been raised about whether notice pay can be reimbursed under furlough. I would say there are particular risks about paying in lieu, because if you pay in lieu of notice, they might not be wage costs in the sense that they are not pay in respect of a period of employment. So be very, very cautious about paying in lieu in the hope or expectation of recovering reimbursement under the scheme. You may not get it. And of course, if you are having employees work out their notice, be mindful of the usual rules about what must be paid during the notice period, which turn on whether or not the employee is entitled to a contractual notice period, which is at least 1 week more generous than stat notice. So lots of issues around what to do at the end of furlough. Some clarification as a result of the direction issued this week. That's the update. Obviously, I'm sure we will readdress some of these points during questions.
Thank you, Andrew, for that update. And just give a shout out to my colleague, Holly, who I can see is answering lots of questions in the chat by directing people to the FAQs. So thank you, Holly. Now just going to hand over to Jenny from Domestic and General, who's going to give a practical case study of how they've applied furlough and what they're thinking about next steps. Thank you, Jenny.
Great, thank you, Katie. Good afternoon, everybody, and so thank you for welcoming me to join the call today. So just a little bit about Domestic and General for those of you not familiar with our company. So we are an appliance and insurance provider. We're 1 in 4 customers, so you may have one of our products. And we have around about 2,500 employees globally. The UK is our largest country, so we've got 2,000 employees who work across 4 locations. So Wimbledon is our head office. We have 2 contact centres in Brighton and Nottingham, and we have a smaller contact centre in Bedworth as well. So in response to COVID-19, we put an immediate plan in place, and effectively, as soon as the Prime Minister announced mandatory home working and social distancing, we started to close our offices. So we immediately closed Wimbledon, everybody went home working, and then we slowly started to sort of ramp down the 2 contact centres. So essentially within about 2 weeks, we did have managed to get 100% of our employees home working, which was an incredible achievement. COVID-19 is also having a financial impact on our business. So our call volumes are week on week, that they are declining, and they're monitored obviously on a daily basis. And that's impacting our revenue. Now, interestingly, we do monitor our sales conversions really carefully. We are still serving our customers, we are still selling our products, but at a much reduced rate than in a normal economic environment. So from a business perspective, our CEO is continued to deliver a message around preserving our cash position and safeguarding the business for the future. And that message that we're continuing to push out to the business. So in terms of furlough, I recognise that you have done a lot of sessions on this. I didn't want to spend too much time around the process, but just very briefly, as at the point where the job retention scheme was launched, we put a proposal together to go to the board to recommend that we implement a programme of furloughing our employees. And once that was approved, we rapidly identified around about 20% of our employees within the UK. And within 6 working days, we'd notified and put all of those furloughed, all those employees on furlough. It took us a little bit longer to do it across the European locations. So we're in France, Germany, Spain, Italy, just because we had the different schemes in different countries. So it took us a little bit longer. But for the UK, within those 6 working days, we'd had everybody identified on furlough. Interestingly, at the time of implementing furlough, we asked for verbal consent during those furlough conversations, and we followed that up with written email to confirm the decision, but clearly with the new advice that's come out, we need to get back on that. And in terms of the timeline, we said that we'd expect the period of furlough to be to the end of May, and that could be extended. Now, fortunately for us, which did make some of the conversations and the implementation much easier, that our board agreed that we would top up salaries. So for those who went over the government cap, we agreed that we would top up those salaries to 80% of the individual's gross salary. So as I said, the conversations around implementing furlough were much easier for line managers, and people were generally very understanding of why the business was doing this. So in terms of what we're doing to engage our furloughed employees and keeping in touch, that myself and the leadership team that I sit on, we just felt really strongly that showing that sort of compassion and empathy and keeping in touch with our furloughed employees is really important. So we came up with a programme called D&G In Touch, and that programme is made up of effectively two parts. So one is around communications, and the second part is around some learning and development initiatives. So from a communications perspective, we have an internal sort of magazine which we call Heads Up, and that shares sort of news and updates, business messages, some fun facts, and we have started to send that to all of our furlough employees. So the first one went out last week, the next one will go out in next week, so we're doing every other week. And it was just a way of helping our furloughed employees really keep in touch with what's happening in the business in a sort of informal, fun way. We also have invited our furloughed employees to join us, our CEO broadcaster. He does a CEO broadcast every week. That goes out to all people managers via Microsoft Teams. And we've invited our furloughed people managers to join those broadcasts. And they are really important, actually. So what our CEO is very good at is giving both personal but business messages as well. So people look to him in terms of the leadership and the direction of the business. And again, we just felt it's important our furloughed employees heard that and felt they still, feel connected to the business. And then we are also starting from next week to run a number of really sort of learning programs, so some webinars on various topics. So the first one we've got next week is around developing a learning mindset. So you'll be aware that lots of sort of different webinars and learning and training can take place. So we just wanted to start with our people to help get people in the right learning mindset, so people can get into some sort of routine around learning and using the time whilst on furlough to develop and self-develop. We've also been asked to cover another topics, which is interestingly, so one on financial well-being. So I'm just working with an external provider to help us do something on that. And then another topical subjects which come up as well. We are also working quite closely with Gallup. So Gallup are our engagement partners. We will run a pulse survey in 2 weeks' time with our furloughed employees. And that's really just to seek feedback in terms of how they're feeling and also what more we can do to support our employees during this time. So that's something we've got planned to come. And for our agents and our team leaders, we're required to do CPD with this population. So my learning team are currently building content on their mandatory learning topics so that we can use the time whilst they're on furlough to get up to date with the CPD content. So that's due to come out from next week as well. And then finally, we work really closely with our people managers. So we are actively encouraging our people managers to keep in touch with their teams and their members on furlough. So having informal coffee drinks and informal chats using Teams. So we've maintained everybody having that system access, which has been quite important. The next step, so this is the, I suppose the unknown, this is the sort of an uncertain bit for us at the moment. So we have put a plan together for how we start to think about returning our furloughed employees back to work. So we are not at the moment thinking about any sort of redundancy programme. So that hasn't come into the conversations at all. So it's very much around how do we plan, how do we transition our furloughed employees back into work. So we have a 4-week plan at the moment that's made up of, again, a number of interventions. So for example, we've built in a webinar from our CEO to welcome people back. We are looking at doing effectively a sort of an onboarding programme or a re-onboarding programme. So where our employees come back to work, we can give some department updates. And then I'm really keen to do some sort of check-ins with our returning employees. So really just do some regular touch points around reflections and feedback, which helps us determine what we can learn and what we know from our own experiences of this. For our agents, which is a bigger population, in terms of what drives their engagement, what we want to focus on, so lots around wellbeing and recognition, which we get a lot of requests to drive this centrally for our agent population. So we're not 100% sure how the transition back to work. We're obviously looking at the government's guidance on that and whether it'll be a phased return. We just don't know. And potentially as well, we're looking at how we return to work. So could that be everybody back to the office, or could it be that we return to furlough and back to home working? So we're just being quite flexible and quite agile in how we implement our furlough implementation plan. But that's something obviously that we'll keep very close to. So Katie just asked me to give maybe a little bit of advice in terms of people professionals around getting furlough right. So there's
Oh dear, I think we've
things they're probably done furloughing, being empathetic and being compassionate. And I know David mentioned that at the beginning. Those for me are really, as HR professionals, quite easy to forget. We often have to deliver quite difficult messages for our business, but being empathetic and being compassionate is really important. So employees will experience a loss of purposeful contribution during this time and a loss of
I think we're losing you a little bit.
is for me, I think, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, just losing you slightly. So you're just, I think we just got the importance of compassion and being empathetic.
Okay, sorry, let me try that again. Sorry about that. So, yes, so my point was around being empathetic and compassionate. I think as HR professionals, it's very easy for us to forget to do that when we have to deliver quite difficult messages for the business. So maintaining that empathy and compassion is really important. And then my second advice is about that keeping in touch. So for people on furlough who probably feel anxious, who feel, they feel isolated, having that regular touch point as line managers is really important. And I'm always advocating to our line managers to keep in touch. And I think balancing that with something that's driven centrally from HR, as well as local line managers following up and keeping in touch is really important. So those are the two bits of advice for me. So compassion and empathy, but that regular and consistent touch point with your furloughed employees. Thank you, Katie. I hope I didn't drop out too much, and I hope that they got that message.
I'm going to ask you a quick question that's popped up just before we get onto some of the legal stuff. Was can you offer any advice if the employees on furlough are a bit less tech savvy? So it's online. So is there any other?
Yeah. So the other thing that we did do as part of the communication is that we asked the employee whether we could use their personal email addresses, and could we keep in touch with them that way as well. So the communications which I mentioned before and the plan that we've done, we have also pushed that out to personal email addresses. So for people who didn't want to use Teams or didn't want to connect to their personal systems, we've got contact via their personal email addresses as well.
Brilliant, thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Going to move on to questions now. Andrew, you covered some of the kind of what next, but got a few things about if the scheme isn't extended after the 31st of May, what are the legal implications for then making those staff redundant? And could you start consultation while people are furloughed, or does that actually count as work?
I certainly think you can start consultation whilst people are on furlough. So there's no issue around that. And there was a question I saw around how that's done in the current circumstances. And I think that discussions via email, by phone are fine. That's all we can reasonably expect employers to do at the moment. That's subject to the one issue around furloughing itself, which is that it's clear now that the agreement must be in writing. And the wording of the direction suggests it must be a two-way communication as well. So that must be in writing. In terms of the scheme and whether or not it's extended after the 31st of May, I think that the major legal implication for making staff redundant at the end of that period, if that proves to be necessary, is around what I touched on in the legal update. it will be very risky to rely on any furlough selection process when making redundancies, because those decisions were often made in a hurry for obvious reasons. Individual decisions to furlough may well have been based on the medical history or the family responsibilities of the individual employees concerned. So obviously, if you then take that assessment and transpose it onto a redundancy consultation, you're setting yourself up for a real risk of indirect discrimination claims. So really, you need to start from scratch, as you would with any redundancy process. Think about the needs of the business and conduct a selection process on that basis, disregarding really what's gone on before in terms of furlough.
Thank you. And if a furlough letter's already been sent and agreed in writing, do you then need to send another letter every 3 weeks if you're going to keep extending it? Or does it just kind of, is it one and done?
I think it depends on the nature of the original agreement. So as I said, some employers may have agreed a fixed or limited period of furlough. I think where that's the case, at the end of that period, you have to renew the agreement in some way if it's to continue. However, if you've agreed to furlough until further notice, probably no further notification required. However, that's all subject to this Treasury direction, which has just changed the wording a little bit and talks about securing agreement now that the employee will cease all work, and that agreement being recorded in writing. And I think a follow-up letter would be a good way of ensuring that that was done for everybody. Just a quick follow-up letter, just getting in touch. This is where we are as a business. You remain on furlough, but we'll keep you updated as to what's happening. As we've agreed, you will cease all work in relation to your employment until the furlough period ends. Could you just drop me a quick line to confirm your agreement to this? Mm-hmm. Something like that should suffice. The objective here, I think, is to head off the risk of fraud. So absent that risk in a significant sense, I think that sort of follow-up letter should suffice for those purposes.
Thank you. Got a question for both of you. Whoever wants to chip in, a few questions around keeping in touch, how, and taking that kind of approach, how are you making sure that that's not misconstrued as working in some way? I don't know, Jenny, how you kind of figured that out, and Andrew, if you've got any advice on if you're asking people to check in on comms or social media pages, how you make sure that's not classed as working?
I'll go first, Jennifer. I mean, I think it's fine to stay in touch with people. I think that's encouraged, and that's the right thing to do. And I think accessing social media and the like is fine. If there's a way of blocking access to work emails or otherwise recording activity, I think if you can capture that information now, that will be helpful to you later if there is an HMRC audit. But this process isn't about cutting off all contact with employees. It's about preventing them from conducting activity on the part of the business in terms of generating revenue or providing services. So if you're clearly avoiding that, I don't see there being an issue with staying in touch otherwise.
Yeah, and I guess just to add to that, so our approach has been very much around is keeping in touch and staying connected and making sure that our employees don't feel isolated from the business. And so we obviously got that sort of audit lens to everything that we're doing as well, so we are quite careful on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. As every time, we've had some questions about holiday. Can we ask furloughed employees to take holidays during their furlough? How should we pay? Would it break furlough time and length? Andrew, have we got any clarity?
We have absolutely no clarity on that at all. I mean, everyone got excited a week or two ago about a tweet from HMRC, I think it was from their customer service team, that suggested you could place people on annual leave while they were furloughed as long as you paid to 100%. There's been absolutely nothing by way of follow-up, either in the guidance or in the direction. So really, the question remains unanswered. If you were adopting a belt and braces approach, you would probably look to line up a minimum 3-week furlough period before agreeing annual leave. But of course, if that's the case, everyone's furlough period was disrupted by the Easter break last weekend. So you would hope that common sense will prevail on this. There's certainly nothing that says that annual leave is incompatible with furlough. Let's put it that way. So nothing to say that you can't do it. I think if you do it, you should be prepared to pay 100% of salary. Or if you pay 80%, keep 20% in a kitty in case you're challenged on it later. But I think subject to that, there's nothing that says you cannot furlough and combine that with annual leave. But just be cautious because we don't have the guidance that confirms that.
Do you expect that we'll get further guidance?
I think probably the Treasury direction is the last word on this for a little while. Some have surmised that this won't be resolved at all in guidance because the guidance and the scheme are coming out of HMRC. They're not employment law oriented so much as payroll oriented, and that's the way the scheme operates. So some feel that this may not be resolved until we start to get claims on this way down the line. You would hope, though, we won't have to wait that long and that some guidance will be forthcoming. Certainly it's on radars because otherwise why the tweet? So we'll see. But at the moment, no guidance at all.
Thank you. And if you are going to be making redundancies, what does consultation look like when you're still social distancing and working remotely? Is a phone call enough to speak with the employee and let them know? This is about furlough, but I guess it applies to redundancy as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think whatever means are available to you, whether it be this kind of communication, video conferencing, phone call, email, even post. What we clearly cannot do at the moment is hold face-to-face meetings. So I think employers will be judged on what they can reasonably do in the circumstances. There's even a special circumstances defence in consultation claims, but query whether they apply here because it is possible to communicate, albeit not directly face-to-face. So I would say in the circumstances, email, phone is fine.
Thank you. We've got a few questions around including commission as part of the 80%. Could you just clarify the situation on that?
Yeah, the feeling is based on the original guidance and what's come out since in terms of the direction. If you are paying contractual commission or if you're due to pay contractual commission, then that would be could be reimbursed under the scheme up to the cap. But that anything paid on a discretionary basis or anything performance related as opposed to commission based is more problematic because it's clearly set out as being excluded from the scheme in the latest communication. So if it's contractual commission, I would say that should be okay.
Can I just add to the point around consultation and approaching that at the moment? It's obviously exceptionally difficult times, and there is a higher percentage chance than ever before that you will start consulting with someone and then find out that actually something's been happening in the background, either in terms of bereavement or in terms of their health. So if you think furlough automatically puts you less in contact with your employees than you would normally be, there's a chance that you'd be starting up a conversation without being aware of that context. So it's worth, for any organisations considering that, thinking about what their process will be when you phone someone up to talk to them or you make contact to start a consultation and you find out that they've had an immediate bereavement in the family or they're in particularly exceptional circumstances. So there's that bit of compassion to go with the policy and the procedure as well.
Thank you, David. If you're bringing people back from furlough, are notice periods required? And I think I spotted a question asking if you need to get, as you need to get agreement in writing to go on furlough, do you need agreement in writing to come off furlough?
I think it would be wise to record that in writing, but no, because you're then bringing them back into employment and the two-way relationship between employer and employee is then resuming. I think you would just record a conversation as you would in the normal way, speak face-to-face or over the phone, and then just follow up with an email or letter confirming what's been discussed and confirming the arrangement for someone to return. So I think approaching that in the usual way that you might approach any comms is fine. The issues around placing people onto furlough, because that then puts you in the position of claiming funds from HMRC, from the government, and that's where you've got to be more careful and comply with the terms of the scheme.
Mm-hmm. Somebody's asked if, sorry, there's a lot of figures in here, so bear with me, I read it off my phone. If the 80% of salary employee is, let's say, £2,000, shall we claim to HMRC £2,000 plus NI plus pension contribution, or only £2,000?
I think you can claim 80% or 2,500, whichever is the lower. So in that case, you'd claim for 2,000. If somebody earned 2,000, then you claim 80% of 2,000, not the full 2,000 is what I should say. So it's a lower of 2,500 or 80% of their wage costs that you claim for.
Thank you. This isn't quite a furlough related question, but I think it's something that quite a lot of businesses have done or are considering. So I don't know, David and Jenny might also have a view on this. If you're considering or doing salary and pay cuts, do you need to do collective consultation? How do you get consent? How do you best approach it? Who wants to chime in on that?
I don't know if Jennifer's frozen or she's just, I was trying to wait for her to see if she wants to go first. I don't think there'd be any particular reason why that would be different to the normal processes that you need to go through. It's you know, the background is unique, but there's no particular reason that any of the rest of employment law or contractual obligations would be changing at the moment beyond these schemes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess just from a domestic and general perspective, so again, we're not kind of considering that at the moment. It's not sort of an option for us, thankfully. So yeah, so it's not applicable to us at the moment.
I mean, I agree. You'd approach it in the usual way. I mean, the consultation requirements don't strictly kick in the case of a renegotiation, but the alternative nearly always is dismissal and re-engagement. And so, because you're potentially looking at dismissal of a high number of people, you would have to consult to comply with Section 188 of TORA.
Thank you. We're organising a round of wellbeing talks for staff that would be provided by an external provider on Zoom. Would furloughed staff be allowed to attend that? Does that kind of fall into the kind of activity you're doing, Jenny?
So yes, actually, so one of the modules that we've got planned for furloughed employees actually is on financial wellbeing. So rather than kind of health and mental wellbeing, so we are planning to do that. We're doing a lot of wellbeing activity for our current employees, but not specifically wellbeing for our furloughed employees.
Thank you.
I would say on that, the guidance talks about not carrying out any work, and that includes anything generating revenue or anything in the way of provision of services. So it doesn't confine activity to those, but if it's clearly a social get together,
yeah, and
you've got a good paper trail that shows that's the case, then again, I think that should be okay. There shouldn't be a problem with that at all.
Okay. It's got a couple of questions asking about if you were making redundancies anyway for non-COVID-19 related reasons, could you still go ahead with those, or should you be re-employing people and then furloughing them?
No, it's clear that furlough is just one option, and that the options of redundancy, layoff and short-time working, if they're in the contract, are all still open to employers. So if the circumstances demand it and they need to go down that route, they still can.
I just the only context would be that the overall, so that is absolutely the correct legal answer, as you would expect from Andrew. The overarching point of this scheme is to try and avoid people being made unnecessarily redundant or being put out into an economy or working environment where it's incredibly difficult to find work. So whilst that's absolutely possible to do, the reflecting on your ethical obligations as an organisation and what you want to stand for, and whether you do want to be releasing people at the moment if you don't have to, or whether you would be willing to furlough them to avoid them leaving the organisation entirely in that way, and maybe delay that, I think is a viable option. So it's worth thinking about what the right thing is to do as well as what you can do.
Mm-hmm. And David, I'll ask you, because there was a question about do we worry that people are using this scheme in the spirit to which it is intended? I can't actually find the question now, but I registered it.
Yeah, I think it's an absolute worry. It's a rapidly designed scheme operating at absolute volume in a way that's been completely untested. I think it's doubtless there will be abuse, and HMRC and the government are obviously attempting to deal with that. We as a professional body are feeding in where we believe there could be improvements to the scheme, and also where we believe that there's more clarity needed. And that's from the point of view of the practical kind of understanding that we need to provide organisations with for HR to be able to do its job well, but also in terms of economic impact. So as with anything at scale, will there be people abusing it? Yes. But actually at the moment, I reckon most people are probably quite glad that we have this rather than just mass unemployment. So I'd rather be dealing with that problem than the other.
Thank you. Question about how we manage returning employees to work after furlough if people are, if you're asking someone to come back and they actually say, I'd rather stay at home on full or 80% pay. Thank you very much. How you deal with that?
And will I deal with you on a Monday, Katie?
Well, I love coming to work.
Furloughing is subject to agreement between employee and employer. So it always has to work for the employer, and there's no right for an employee to request furlough. So if you're at the point in the business where you don't need to furlough people anymore, then employers don't have the right to insist that they continue on furlough, that, you know, you get to the end of that process and something else takes its place.
Yeah, and I'd also say in some of the conversations that I've been having with CPOs recently, people have been bringing people back to work after the 3-week period because perhaps there's been more volume of work than expected, and actually been pleasantly surprised how happy people are to get back to work. It hasn't been an issue because people are maybe come to the end of those 3 weeks and are happy to be gainfully employed and have stuff to do again. And I think work is a lot more than a paycheck for a lot of people. Definitely.
Yeah.
So I had a question here that I've managed to lose. Yeah, is there a population of employees who we should consider medically suspending rather than furloughing, i.e. over 70s, pregnant, those are the disability? Andrew, one for you.
I think it's possible to consider that where medical suspension would be on full pay, and obviously absent any contractual clause to the contrary, it probably would have to be. There'd be an issue if you were lawfully entitled to suspend without pay or on low pay, because that might put those people at a disadvantage when compared with furloughed staff, and of course that leaves you open again to claims of discrimination. So I think you'd need to carefully consider your right to medically suspend under the contract, and if anybody going down that route would suffer a detriment essentially as a result of being placed on medical suspension as opposed to being furloughed, be very, very careful about doing it, because it would leave you open to claims.
Thank you. If you've got an employee who holds 2 jobs in a company, one full-time and one part-time, can you furlough one job and let them work the other job?
Yeah, this is a really difficult one. It's not addressed in the guidance, but when the guidance talks about other work, it talks about other work for other organisations. So I think if you were being cautious here, you would furlough from both positions.
Thank you. Right, I'm afraid I think I'm going to have to bring that to a close there. That's all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank David and Andrew and Jennifer for giving their time up to share their thoughts and give some practical guidance. And as ever, Andrew, thank you for unpicking a lot of the very sticky legal stuff. And I appreciate that a lot of guidance came out in the past week and you've had to become an expert on all of it. So thank you so much for that. A reminder that this webinar will be available on demand, and please do look out for future webinars on coronavirus related topics. Our next 2 will not be on furlough. I think we potentially have reached our limit on furlough, and instead we'll be addressing health and well-being. We'll be talking about health and well-being for your remote workers, so those of us who are working from home at the moment, so how you can keep them happy, healthy and engaged. And we're also going to have a webinar on how you can look after essential workers, so how you can keep them healthy and safe when they aren't able to work from home. Do keep checking the CIPD's Coronavirus Hub for the most up-to-date guidance. We are updating it all the time, and I see that Holly has flagged a couple of things that came up in the Q&A that we will definitely be adding to guidance, so do keep an eye on that. And if you are a member, remember, oh, sorry, I made a little rhyme there, I didn't mean to do that. Remember that you can access free employment law advice via HR Inform. So thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time. Have a lovely weekend. Thanks.